The notification popped up on my phone at exactly 11:47 p.m. the night before my graduation. 4 years of sleepless nights, countless coding projects, and maintaining a perfect GPA had led to this moment, and I was finally going to walk across that stage at the University of Texas at Austin. I opened our family group chat, heart pounding with excitement, as I typed the message that would change everything. Graduation is tomorrow at 2 p.m. Frank Irwin Center. Can't wait to see you all there. The typing bubbles appeared almost immediately. My stomach dropped as I watched my father's response materialize on screen. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Sorry, Maya, big client meeting came up. David's closing the Riverside deal. Can't make it. Then my mother chimed in with her own devastating blow. Have my book club retreat this weekend. Already paid the deposit. Maybe next time. Maybe next time. As if I was planning to graduate from college again anytime soon. I stared at those words until they blurred together, my chest tightening with each passing second. 4 years of sacrifice, of choosing library study sessions over parties, of building apps while my classmates were building hangovers, and they couldn't reschedule a book club meeting? The cruel irony wasn't lost on me that David, my older brother, who barely scraped through business school with a C average, was apparently too busy making money to watch his sister achieve something he never could. The morning of graduation arrived with that particular Austin humidity that makes your clothes stick to your skin before you even step outside. I sat in my cramped apartment near campus, surrounded by the organized chaos of 4 years of college life. Empty energy drink cans lined my desk like trophies from late-night coding sessions, while my laptop displayed the final project that had earned me the highest grade in Dr. Williams's advanced cybersecurity course. My roommate Alex had already left for their own family celebration, leaving me alone with my thoughts and the silence that felt heavier than it should on what was supposed to be one of the happiest days of my life. The apartment we shared was nothing glamorous, just a standard 2-bedroom place with thin walls and a temperamental air conditioning unit that chose the worst possible moments to give up. My side of the living room was dominated by multiple monitors, tangled charging cables, and printed research papers that I'd highlighted until they looked like rainbow abstracts. Everything about this space screamed broke college student, but it was mine in a way that my childhood bedroom in my parents' Westlake Hills mansion never had been. Here, surrounded by the evidence of my hard work, I felt accomplished rather than judged. I pulled up the family group chat again, scrolling through months of messages that painted a clear picture of priorities. David's real estate victories were celebrated with multiple congratulatory emojis and lengthy responses about family legacy. My coding competition wins were met with simple thumbs-up reactions, if they were acknowledged at all. When I'd announced my acceptance into the honors program last semester, my mother had responded with a forwarded meme about coffee addiction. When David had bought his 3rd investment property, they'd thrown him a dinner party at the most expensive steakhouse in town. The irony of it all was that while they were building their real estate empire, I was building something that could potentially change how people interacted with technology. My senior capstone project, a cybersecurity app that could detect and prevent identity theft in real time, had already caught the attention of several major tech companies. But to my parents, anything that couldn't be measured in square footage or profit margins might as well have been imaginary. My phone buzzed with a text from Jordan, my best friend, and the one person who truly understood what this day meant to me. Jordan was majoring in journalism with a focus on technology reporting, and they'd been documenting my journey through college with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed my story mattered. Hey, superstar, ready to walk across that stage and show everyone what you're made of? Also, got some interesting news about that interview opportunity I mentioned. Call me when you can. The interview opportunity. 3 weeks ago, Jordan had connected me with a producer at KXAN, the local Austin news station, that ran a weekly segment called Austin Innovators. They were looking for young entrepreneurs and tech developers to feature in their ongoing series about the city's growing reputation as a technology hub. Initially, I'd been hesitant to put myself out there, but Jordan had convinced me that my work deserved recognition beyond the confines of academic circles. I stepped into the shower, letting the lukewarm water wash away the sting of my family's absence. As I stood there, I made a mental list of everyone who would be watching me graduate. Dr. Williams had promised to attend, along with several of my professors who had become mentors over the years. Aunt Sarah, my father's sister, who worked as a software engineer at a major tech company, had driven down from Dallas specifically for the ceremony. Jordan would be there with their camera, ready to capture every moment for the digital portfolio they'd been helping me build. The absence of my immediate family felt like a physical weight, but as I got dressed in my cap and gown, I realized something important. The people who mattered, the ones who had actually supported my journey and understood my dreams, would be there. Sometimes the family you choose is more meaningful than the one you're born into. Getting ready for graduation felt surreal. I'd imagined this moment countless times over the past 4 years, picturing my parents' faces in the crowd, seeing my mother cry happy tears for once instead of the frustrated ones I'd grown accustomed to. I'd fantasized about my father finally understanding that what I was doing was just as valuable as David's real estate ventures, maybe even more so considering the innovative potential of my work. Instead, I was getting ready alone, applying makeup with hands that trembled slightly from a combination of nerves and disappointment. The graduation gown felt heavier than it should, weighted down by expectations that would go unmet and celebrations that would feel hollow. But as I looked at myself in the mirror, something shifted. The woman staring back at me had earned this moment through her own determination and brilliance. She didn't need validation from people who had never bothered to understand her dreams. My phone rang, interrupting my thoughts. The caller ID showed Aunt Sarah's name, and I answered with genuine relief.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Maya, I'm just pulling into Austin now. Traffic was absolutely insane, but I wouldn't miss this for the world. How are you holding up, sweetie? Her voice carried the warmth that had been absent from my parents' messages, and I felt some of the tension in my shoulders begin to release. I'm okay, I told her, though we both knew it was only partially true. Just getting ready to head over to campus. Jordan's picking me up in about an hour. There was a pause on the other end of the line, and I could practically hear her choosing her words carefully. Maya, I know your parents' absence hurts, and I'm not going to pretend it doesn't matter, but I want you to know that what you've accomplished is extraordinary. I've been in this industry for 15 years, and the kind of innovative thinking you've demonstrated with your projects is exactly what the tech world needs. Your parents might not understand it now, but history will prove you right. Her words hit me harder than I'd expected, and I had to blink back tears that threatened to ruin my carefully applied makeup. Thank you, Aunt Sarah. That means more to me than you know. We talked for a few more minutes about the ceremony logistics and plans for afterward, and by the time I hung up, I felt steadier than I had all morning. Jordan arrived right on time, pulling up in their beat-up Honda Civic that had somehow survived 4 years of college adventures. They bounded up to my apartment with the kind of infectious energy that made it impossible to stay completely miserable, carrying a small bouquet of flowers and wearing the biggest smile I'd seen all week. There she is, the woman who's about to change the tech world, Jordan exclaimed, pulling me into a hug that smelled like the vanilla perfume they'd worn since freshman year. And before you say anything about your parents not being there, I want you to remember something. Some of the most successful people in history had families who didn't believe them initially, but you know what they all had in common? They had friends who saw their potential and documented their journey. As we drove toward campus, Jordan filled me in on the details of the news interview opportunity. The KXN producer had been impressed by the portfolio Jordan had sent, particularly the documentation of my app development process and the early beta testing results. They wanted to feature me in next week's Austin Innovators segment, focusing on how young entrepreneurs were shaping the city's technological landscape. The timing is actually perfect. Jordan explained as we navigated the graduation day traffic. They want to film the interview on Monday, and having it right after your graduation will give us a great narrative arc, from college student to emerging tech entrepreneur. It's the kind of story that could really open doors for you. I felt a flutter of excitement mixed with nervousness. Being featured on local television would be a significant step toward establishing myself as a serious player in Austin's tech scene. It might even catch the attention of investors or potential business partners who could help me take my cybersecurity app to the next level. The University of Texas campus was buzzing with activity as families arrived for the various graduation ceremonies scheduled throughout the day. Parents carried flowers and balloons, siblings wore t-shirts with proud messages, and grandparents moved slowly but deliberately toward the venues where they would watch their grandchildren achieve academic milestones. The contrast between their excited energy and my own mixed emotions was stark, but I tried to focus on the positive aspects of the day. Dr. Williams found me in the crowd of computer science graduates, her face lighting up when she spotted me adjusting my cap for the third time. She'd been more than just a professor to me. She'd been a mentor who encouraged me to pursue my most ambitious projects and connected me with internship opportunities that had shaped my understanding of the industry. Maya, today's the day we've all been waiting for. I have to tell you, I've been bragging about your capstone project to colleagues at other universities. The practical applications of your cybersecurity innovations are going to make waves in the industry. Her enthusiasm was genuine and infectious, reminding me why I'd fallen in love with computer science in the first place. As we lined up for the processional, I spotted Aunt Sarah in the crowd, waving enthusiastically and holding up her phone to capture every moment. Jordan was positioned strategically with their professional camera, ready to document the ceremony from multiple angles. Looking at them, I realized that while my family situation was disappointing, I wasn't actually alone. The graduation ceremony itself passed in a blur of speeches, applause, and the surreal moment when my name was called and I walked across the stage to receive my diploma. Dr. Williams shook my hand with extra warmth, and for those few seconds, I felt the pure joy of achievement without the shadow of family disappointment clouding it. But even as I smiled for the cameras and accepted congratulations from my classmates, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning of something much bigger than a graduation ceremony. The news interview scheduled for Monday felt like a doorway to a future I was only beginning to imagine. And somehow I knew that my parents' absence today would end up being far more significant than any of us realized. The graduation reception was held in the Computer Science Building's main atrium, a modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that let in the harsh Texas afternoon sun. Alumni mingled with current students, while professors moved between groups, sharing stories and offering career advice. The smell of catered sandwiches and sheet cake filled the air, mixing with the excited chatter of families celebrating their graduates' achievements. I found myself gravitating to a corner where several of my classmates had gathered around a display showcasing student projects from the past semester. My cybersecurity app was featured prominently, complete with screenshots of the user interface and a detailed explanation of how the algorithm detected potential identity theft attempts. Dr. Williams had insisted on including it, despite my protest that it wasn't ready for public scrutiny. Jordan appeared at my side with 2 cups of punch and a knowing look. Your parents still haven't responded to any of your texts, have they? They didn't need to wait for my answer. My expression told them everything. You know what? Forget them for now. Look around this room. Everyone here understands what you've accomplished, and that's what matters today. As if summoned by Jordan's words, David suddenly materialized in the doorway of the atrium. My older brother stood there in his expensive suit, looking completely out of place among the casual academic crowd.
Perfectly styled, his shoes polished to a mirror shine, and he carried himself with the confidence of someone who had never doubted his place in the world. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope that maybe he'd come to support me after all. "Maya," he called out, striding across the room with the kind of purposeful walk that commanded attention. Several conversations paused as people turned to watch this obvious outsider navigate through the crowd of academics and students. "Congratulations on finally finishing school. Dad sent me to represent the family since he couldn't make it himself." The word "finally" hit me like a physical slap, as if 4 years of maintaining a perfect GPA while developing innovative software was somehow taking too long. as if my academic achievements were a minor inconvenience that had kept the family waiting. I forced my expression to remain neutral, aware that Jordan was watching every micro-expression and that several of my professors were within earshot. "Thanks for coming, David. I didn't expect to see anyone from the family here." My voice came out steadier than I felt, though I could hear the slight edge that crept in despite my best efforts. David either didn't notice or chose to ignore it, launching into what sounded like a rehearsed speech about family obligations and business priorities. "You know how it is with the company. We're in the middle of our biggest expansion yet, and Dad needs all hands on deck. The Riverside development alone is worth more than most people make in a lifetime." He paused, looking around the room with barely concealed disdain. "But he wanted me to tell you that there's always a place for you in the family business once you're done playing with computers." Playing with computers. The dismissive phrase hung in the air between us, and I saw Dr. Williams's eyebrows raise slightly from across the room. Jordan's grip tightened on their punch cup, and I could practically feel their internal struggle not to say something that would escalate the situation. David seemed oblivious to the tension he'd created, continuing his monologue about real estate markets and profit margins as if we were at a business networking event rather than my graduation reception. "Actually," I said, interrupting his explanation of cap rates and investment returns, "I'm not planning to join the family business. I'm starting my own tech company focused on cybersecurity solutions." The words came out with more conviction than I'd felt all day, and I realized that saying them out loud made them feel more real. David's expression shifted to something between amusement and concern. The look he'd given me throughout childhood when I'd announced ambitious projects that he assumed I'd eventually abandon. "Maya, that's a nice hobby, but you need to think practically about your future. Tech startups fail 90% of the time. Real estate is stable, profitable, and we already have an established client base. Dad's offering you a guaranteed income and a path to partnership." The condescension in his tone was unmistakable, and I noticed that our conversation had drawn the attention of several nearby groups. My classmates, professors, and their families were all witnessing this public dismissal of my career ambitions by my own brother. The humiliation burned in my chest, but something else was building alongside it, a determination that surprised me with its intensity. "I appreciate Dad's offer," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the suddenly quiet section of the atrium. "But I'm confident in my abilities and my business plan. Sometimes the biggest risks lead to the most significant rewards." I met his gaze directly, refusing to look away first. David shrugged with the casual indifference of someone who had never faced real consequences for underestimating others. "Well, when reality hits and you realize how difficult it actually is to build a business from scratch, the offer will still be there. Dad's patient, but he won't wait forever." He moved through the rest of the reception like a politician working a room, introducing himself to my professors with the kind of smooth confidence that came naturally to someone raised in sales environments. I watched him charm Dr. Williams with questions about the university's industry partnerships, seemingly oblivious to the way her responses grew shorter and more formal with each exchange. When he approached Aunt Sarah, I saw her expression tighten in a way that suggested their conversation wasn't going as smoothly as his others. The contrast between David's presence and the academic atmosphere was jarring. Where the professors and students engaged in thoughtful discussions about research and innovation, David steered every conversation toward practical applications and monetary value. He wasn't necessarily wrong about the importance of business considerations, but his inability to appreciate the intellectual achievement aspect of what we were celebrating felt like a fundamental disconnect. Jordan stayed close to my side throughout the David's impromptu networking session, occasionally offering supportive comments or steering conversations in directions that highlighted my accomplishments rather than my family's business success. Their loyalty meant more to me than they probably realized, especially when I caught them diplomatically redirecting one of David's more dismissive comments about impractical academic pursuits. When David finally announced that he needed to leave for another business meeting, I felt a complex mixture of relief and disappointment. Relief because his presence had been creating an undercurrent of tension that was affecting my ability to enjoy my own reception, but disappointment because his departure felt like another confirmation that my achievements simply weren't worth prioritizing over his professional obligations. "I'll tell Mom and Dad you said hello," he said, checking his expensive watch as he prepared to leave. "Oh, and Maya, that news interview Jordan mentioned to me, make sure you don't say anything that might reflect poorly on the family business. We've worked hard to build our reputation in this community." The casual way he delivered this warning, as if my potential media appearance was primarily important for how it might affect their company's image, crystallized something that had been building all day. My family didn't see me as an individual with my own aspirations and achievements. They saw me as an extension of their brand, someone whose actions mattered only insofar as they impacted the family's collective reputation and financial interests. After David left, the atmosphere at the reception seemed to lighten noticeably. My classmates returned to their animated discussions about job offers and graduate school plans, while professors resumed their conversations about research projects and academic collaborations. Dr. Williams approached me with a concerned expression, clearly
having picked up on the tension during David's visit. "Maya, I hope you know that what you've accomplished here is extraordinary, regardless of what anyone in your family might think about the value of technology careers," she said quietly. "I've been in academia for 20 years, and I've rarely seen a student with your combination of technical skill and innovative thinking. Don't let anyone convince you that what you're doing isn't important." Her words provided some comfort, but they also highlighted the surreal nature of needing reassurance about the value of my own achievements on my graduation day. The fact that my family's dismissive attitude had been so obvious that my professor felt compelled to address it directly was both embarrassing and validating. Aunt Sarah joined our conversation, her expression more serious than I'd seen it all day. "I had an interesting chat with your brother," she said carefully. "He seems to think that technology careers are inherently unstable and that real estate is the only reliable path to financial security. I tried to explain that the tech industry has created more millionaires under 30 than any other sector in the past decade, but he didn't seem particularly interested in hearing alternative perspectives." The diplomatic way she phrased her criticism of David's narrow worldview was typical of Aunt Sela's approach to family politics, but I could hear the frustration beneath her measured words. As someone who had built a successful career in software engineering, she understood better than anyone how dismissive attitudes toward technology could limit someone's potential. As the reception began winding down, I found myself reflecting on the strange duality of the day. On one level, I had achieved everything I'd worked toward for 4 years. I'd graduated summa cum laude from a respected computer science program, earned recognition for innovative projects, and secured the foundation I needed to launch my own technology company. On another level, the people who should have been most proud of these accomplishments had either ignored them entirely or treated them as stepping stones toward more practical career choices. Jordan finished documenting the reception with their characteristic thoroughness, capturing conversations with professors, shots of the project displays, and candid moments that would help tell the story of my academic journey. As we prepared to leave the computer science building, they showed me some of the footage they'd gathered throughout the day. "You know what's interesting?" Jordan said, scrolling through video clips on their camera. "Every professor I talked to mentioned your potential for making a significant impact in the cybersecurity field. Dr. Williams actually used the word revolutionary when describing your algorithm's approach to identity theft prevention. But your brother spent the entire reception talking about property values and investment returns." The observation wasn't particularly surprising, but seeing it laid out so clearly helped me understand why the day had felt so disorienting. I was existing in 2 completely different value systems simultaneously, one that prioritized intellectual achievement and innovation, and another that measured success purely through financial metrics and traditional business models. We drove back toward campus in Jordan's Honda,
the late afternoon sun creating long shadows across the Austin streets. The graduation crowd was dispersing, with families heading to celebratory dinners and students making plans for their last night before entering the professional world. For most of my classmates, graduation day would be remembered as an unqualified celebration shared with people who understood and appreciated their achievements. "So," Jordan said as we stopped at a red light, "are you ready to talk about Monday's interview? Because after watching your family's reaction today, I'm more convinced than ever that this news segment could be exactly what you need to establish your own identity separate from their expectations." The interview. In all the emotional complexity of dealing with my family's absence and David's condescending visit, I'd almost forgotten about the upcoming opportunity to share my story with a broader audience. The producer had specifically mentioned wanting to focus on young entrepreneurs who were bringing fresh perspectives to traditional industries, and my cybersecurity app definitely fit that description. "What exactly did they say about the format?" I asked, suddenly feeling both nervous and excited about the possibility of reaching an audience that might actually appreciate what I was trying to accomplish. "It's going to be a 15-minute segment during their evening news broadcast. Plus, they'll post an extended version on their website and social media channels. They want to film at your apartment to show your development setup, then do some interview portions at a coffee shop near campus. The whole thing should take about 3 hours to shoot." The prospect of having my work featured on local television felt surreal, especially after a day spent defending its value to family members who couldn't see beyond traditional business models. It would be the first time I'd have a platform to explain my projects to people who weren't already immersed in academic or technology environments. As we pulled into the parking lot of my apartment complex, I realized that Monday's interview represented more than just a career opportunity. It was a chance to define myself and my work on my own terms, without the filter of family expectations or academic constraints. For the first time all day, I felt genuinely excited about what was coming next, rather than disappointed about what had been missing. The evening stretched ahead with its mixture of celebration and solitude, but the anticipation of Monday's interview gave me something positive to focus on beyond the day's emotional complications. Whether my family ever understood or appreciated what I was building, there were other people in the world who might see the value in innovation and be willing to support entrepreneurial ambitions that extended beyond traditional business models. Jordan helped me carrying my graduation flowers and gifts up to my apartment, where Alex had left a congratulatory note and a bottle of champagne with instructions to save it for a truly special occasion. As I changed out of my graduation dress and into comfortable clothes, I found myself thinking less about who hadn't been there to celebrate with me and more about who would be watching when I had the chance to tell my story to a much larger audience. The notification on my phone showed 3 missed calls from my mother and a text message that simply read, "Call me." The brevity of the message and the timing of the calls suggested that David had already reported back about the reception, probably emphasizing my stubborn refusal to consider joining the family business.
Family business over any mention of my academic achievements or professional potential. I set the phone aside without responding, not quite ready to navigate whatever conversation my mother had planned. Monday's interview would give me the opportunity to articulate my vision and demonstrate my capabilities to people who had no preconceived notions about what I should be doing with my life. That felt like a much better use of my energy than defending choices that I'd already committed to making. The apartment felt different that evening, charged with the possibility of new beginnings rather than weighed down by family disappointments. Monday would bring the usual post-graduation mixture of nostalgia and anticipation, but Monday would bring something entirely new, a chance to step into the spotlight on my own terms and show the world what I was really capable of creating. Sunday morning arrived with the kind of oppressive heat that made Austin summers legendary. I woke up in my apartment to 17 missed calls from my mother and a string of increasingly urgent text messages that painted a clear picture of how Saturday's events had been interpreted by my parents. The messages started reasonable enough, asking me to call back to discuss my career decisions, but quickly escalated into accusations about embarrassing the family and making David uncomfortable at my own graduation reception.
The final message, sent at 2:47 a.m., was the one that made my stomach drop. Your attitude yesterday was completely unacceptable. We've worked too hard building our reputation in this community for you to jeopardize it with your selfish behavior. Call me immediately, or there will be consequences. Consequences. The word carried the weight of 22 years of family dynamics, of allowances threatened and privileges revoked whenever I stepped outside the carefully defined boundaries of acceptable Chen family behavior. But what struck me most wasn't the threat itself, but the fact that my mother viewed my graduation day through the lens of how it might affect their social standing, rather than celebrating what I had accomplished. I made coffee with hands that weren't quite steady, replaying yesterday's events through my mother's probable perspective. David had likely focused his report on my defiant refusal to consider joining the family business, my inappropriate decision to pursue entrepreneurship, and perhaps most damaging of all, my willingness to have these conversations in front of professors and other families who might spread word through Austin's professional networks. The coffee maker gurgled to life, filling my small kitchen with the rich aroma that had become my primary source of comfort during 4 years of academic stress. Through the thin walls of my apartment, I could hear Alex moving around in their room, probably preparing for their own family brunch plans. The contrast between their excited phone conversations with relatives and my pile of accusatory messages felt particularly sharp. Jordan's text arrived just as I was contemplating whether to respond to my mother's increasingly frantic communications. Coffee and strategy session? I have some interesting information about tomorrow's interview that you need to hear. Their timing was perfect, providing exactly the excuse I needed to avoid the emotional minefield of family phone calls for a few more hours. We met at Radio Coffee on Barnett Springs Road, a local institution that attracted a mixture of university students, tech workers, and creative professionals who appreciated both the artisanal coffee and the reliable Wi-Fi. The weekend crowd was lighter than usual, giving us a corner table where we could talk without worrying about being overheard by anyone who might recognize my name or connect me to my family's real estate empire. Jordan arrived carrying their laptop bag and wearing the expression they got when they discovered something newsworthy. They ordered their usual lavender latte, while I stopped with black coffee, needing the caffeine more than the comfort of added flavors. The familiar ritual of settling into our favorite spot helped calm some of the anxiety that had been building since I'd read my mother's messages. "So," Jordan said, opening their laptop and pulling up a series of bookmarked articles. "I spent some time researching the KXAN producer who's handling your interview, and I found some very interesting background information. Sarah Martinez has been with the station for 8 years, and she's built a reputation for featuring stories that challenge traditional business narratives in Austin." They turned the laptop screen toward me, showing me a portfolio of previous Austin Innovator segments. The stories featured young entrepreneurs who had disrupted established industries, artists who had built successful creative businesses despite family skepticism, and tech innovators who had chosen unconventional paths to success. The common thread seemed to be people who had succeeded by going against conventional wisdom rather than following predetermined career tracks. "Here's what's really interesting," Jordan continued, clicking through to a particularly relevant segment. "Last month, she featured a woman who left her family law firm to start a sustainable fashion company. The interview focused heavily on the tension between family expectations and personal vision, and it got picked up by several national outlets because of how honestly it addressed generational conflicts in family businesses." The implications weren't lost on me. Sarah Martinez wasn't just looking for feel-good stories about young entrepreneurs. She was specifically interested in narratives that explored the complexities of choosing independent paths despite family pressure. My situation with the Chen family business expectations fit perfectly into that framework. "But here's what gets even more interesting," Jordan said, lowering his voice, even though our corner was relatively private. "I did some research on your family's business dealings, and there are some public records that paint a very different picture than the success story they like to tell." They pulled up another browser window, this one showing Austin city planning documents and property development reports. The Chen Properties name appeared frequently, but not always in flattering contexts. There were multiple citations for permit violations, several complaints filed by neighboring property owners, and at least 3 instances where projected development timelines had been significantly delayed due to what the reports diplomatically termed compliance issues. Your family's business practices haven't exactly been squeaky clean, Jordan explained, scrolling through documentation that painted a picture of a company that prioritized profit margins over regulatory compliance.
On environmental impact assessments, rushing through permit processes, and dealing with the fines later rather than following proper procedures from the beginning. The information was simultaneously shocking and oddly validating. Throughout my childhood, my parents had presented their business as a model of professional success and community contribution. David had grown up believing he was inheriting a respected family legacy that represented the best of Austin's entrepreneurial spirit. But the public records told a story of systematic corner-cutting and regulatory shortcuts that suggested a very different approach to business ethics. "Why are you showing me this?" I asked, though part of me already suspected where Jordan's research was leading. "Because tomorrow's interview isn't just about your tech company," they said seriously. "It's about the choice between 2 different approaches to business success. Your cybersecurity app represents everything your family's company doesn't. Innovation over exploitation, long-term thinking over short-term profits, ethical development over regulatory shortcuts." The contrast was stark when laid out so explicitly. My app was designed to protect people from identity theft and cybersecurity breaches, using innovative algorithms to detect and prevent digital exploitation. Meanwhile, my family's real estate business seemed to operate by finding ways to exploit regulatory loopholes and minimize oversight to maximize profits. "Sarah Martinez specializes in these kinds of stories," Jordan continued. "Young entrepreneurs who are building businesses that represent a generational shift away from their family's questionable practices. If you're willing to be honest about the contrast between your values and your family's business approach, this interview could position you as exactly the kind of ethical innovator that investors and partners want to work with." The suggestion was both thrilling and terrifying. Being honest about my family's business practices would essentially burn bridges that were already strained to the breaking point, but it would also allow me to clearly define my own values and business philosophy in contrast to approaches I had never been comfortable with. My phone buzzed with another text from my mother. "Maya, I expect you to call me within the hour or I'm driving down there myself. This conversation cannot wait any longer." I showed the message to Jordan, who read it with raised eyebrows. "Sounds like they're getting desperate to control the narrative," she observed, "which probably means they're worried about what you might say in tomorrow's interview." That observation crystallized something that had been nagging at me since David's warning about not saying anything that might reflect poorly on the family business. They weren't just dismissive of my career choices. They were actively concerned that my independence might threaten their carefully maintained reputation. The intensity of my mother's messages suggested they viewed my upcoming media appearance as a potential threat, rather than an opportunity to celebrate their daughter's achievements. "What do you think I should do?" I asked, genuinely uncertain about how to navigate the competing pressures of family loyalty and personal integrity. Jordan closed her laptop and leaned back in her chair, considering the question with the seriousness it deserved. "I think you should be honest about your values and let the chips fall where they may. You've spent 4 years building something innovative and ethical. Don't compromise that foundation just to protect people who have never shown the same consideration for your feelings or aspirations." Their advice resonated with something I'd been feeling but hadn't quite articulated. My family's treatment of my graduation had revealed a fundamental disconnect between their values and mine. They measured success through financial metrics and social status, while I was motivated by innovation and the potential to solve meaningful problems through technology. The afternoon stretched ahead with its mixture of interview preparation and family crisis management. Jordan offered to help me practice potential interview questions while I decided how to respond to my mother's escalating demands for an immediate phone conversation. The contrast between these 2 activities perfectly captured the choice I was facing. I could spend my energy managing family expectations and protecting their reputation, or I could focus on articulating my own vision and building the foundation for my independent future. We spent the next 2 hours working through potential interview scenarios, with Jordan playing the role of Sarah Martinez and asking probing questions about my business plans, my family background, and my motivation for choosing entrepreneurship over joining an established company. The practice sessions helped me refine my talking points while also revealing how naturally the contrast between my values and my family's approach emerged in conversation. You light up when you talk about the ethical implications of cybersecurity, Jordan observed after we'd run through several mock interviews. But you get tense and defensive when questions touch on your family's business practices. Sarah Martinez is going to pick up on that dynamic immediately. They were right. The mere mention of Chen properties made me uncomfortable in ways that discussing my own work never did. Part of that discomfort came from loyalty to my family, but a larger part stemmed from genuine disagreement with business practices I had never felt comfortable defending. By late afternoon, I had made a decision that felt both inevitable and terrifying. I would go into tomorrow's interview prepared to be honest about my values and my vision. Even that honesty created conflicts with my family's expectations. The alternative was to spend the rest of my career carefully moderating my public statements to protect a business reputation I had never helped build and didn't particularly respect. The decision felt liberating and dangerous in equal measure. For the first time in years, I was choosing my own path without regard for how that choice might affect my family's comfort or convenience. The prospect of their reaction was genuinely frightening, but the alternative of continuing to subordinate my own goals to their preferences felt worse. Jordan walked me back to my apartment as the sun began to set over Austin, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that reminded me why I loved this city despite all its complexities. The beauty of the evening felt symbolic somehow, as if the universe was providing a gorgeous backdrop for what might be the last night before everything changed. Whatever happens tomorrow, Jordan said as we reached my building, remember that you've already accomplished something extraordinary. You've built something innovative and ethical.
Entirely through your own efforts. That's not something your family can take away from you, no matter how upset they get about your interview. Their words provided comfort, but they also highlighted the strange reality of needing reassurance about my own achievements from friends because my family had proven incapable of providing that support. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I wondered what it said about my childhood that my closest relationships were with people who had known me for 4 years, rather than people who had raised me for 22. The apartment felt different that evening, charged with anticipation rather than weighed down by family tensions. Tomorrow would bring the opportunity to tell my story on my own terms, to define my values publicly, and to establish my identity as something separate from my family's business reputation. The prospect was both exhilarating and terrifying, but it felt honest in a way that family loyalty had never quite managed. I spent the evening preparing for the interview with a mixture of excitement and nervousness that reminded me of the night before my first major coding competition. There was the same sense of having prepared as thoroughly as possible while acknowledging that the actual performance would depend on factors beyond my complete control. The difference was that tomorrow's interview felt like much more than a single event. It felt like the beginning of a completely different kind of life. My phone continued buzzing with messages from my mother throughout the evening, each one more urgent and frustrated than the last. But for the first time in memory, I found it easier to ignore the demands for immediate attention than to drop everything and manage her emotional crisis. Tomorrow's interview had given me something more important to focus on than family drama, and that shift in priorities felt like the most significant change of all. The night stretched ahead with its mixture of preparation and anticipation, but the weight of family expectations felt lighter than it had in years. Whether my parents ever understood or appreciated what I was building, there were other people in the world who might see value in innovation and ethical business practices. Tomorrow would be my chance to find out if my story resonated with audiences beyond the small circle of people who had always known what I was capable of achieving. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that sometimes follows storms, and I woke up feeling more centered than I had in weeks. The 17 missed calls from my mother had finally stopped around 3 a.m., replaced by a single ominous text that simply read, "We're coming to Austin today. Be ready." The lack of specifics was probably intentional, designed to keep me anxious and off balance, but instead it had the opposite effect. After months of walking on eggshells around family expectations, their decision to force a confrontation felt almost liberating. I had spent Sunday evening preparing for the KXAN interview with the kind of methodical focus I usually reserved for major coding projects. My talking points were organized, my demo materials prepared, and most importantly, I had made peace with the decision to be completely honest about my values and vision, regardless of how that honesty might complicate my family relationships. The research Jordan had shared about my family's business practices had crystallized something I'd been feeling for years but never quite articulated. I didn't want to build the kind of success that required compromising my principles. The morning light streaming through my apartment windows illuminated the organized chaos of 4 years of college life, but it also highlighted something new. My laptop sat open on the kitchen table, displaying the final version of my cybersecurity app alongside documentation that proved every aspect of its development had been funded through my own scholarships, grants, and part-time work. The evidence of my independence was overwhelming and undeniable, which would matter more than I realized in the hours to come. Jordan arrived early with coffee and pastries from our favorite local bakery, along with a professional lighting kit they'd borrowed from the journalism department. Big day, they said simply, but their excitement was infectious. They'd been documenting my journey through college with the dedication of someone who genuinely believed the story mattered, and today would be the culmination of that documentation project. As we set up the lighting in my small living room, transforming the space into something that would look professional on camera, I found myself thinking about all the small moments that had led to this opportunity. The late nights debugging code while my classmates were at parties, the weekends spent in the library researching cybersecurity vulnerabilities instead of visiting family, the conscious choice to prioritize my education and my projects over maintaining the kind of relationship my parents expected. The KXAN crew arrived exactly on schedule, professional and efficient in a way that immediately put me at ease. Sarah Martinez was younger than I had expected, probably in her early 30s, with the kind of focused energy that suggested she took her work seriously. Her assistant, Marcus, handled the technical setup, while Sarah reviewed her notes and explained how the interview would be structured. We'll start with some B-roll footage of you working on your app, then move to the coffee shop for the formal interview portion. The whole segment will be about 12 minutes when it airs tonight, but we'll also post an extended version online. The focus is on young entrepreneurs who are bringing fresh perspectives to established industries, and your cybersecurity work definitely fits that description. As we filmed the opening sequences with me demonstrating various features of my app and explaining the development process, I felt the familiar comfort that came with discussing work I was passionate about. The technical aspects were complex, but the core mission was simple: protecting people from digital exploitation by detecting and preventing identity theft attempts in real time. It was the kind of meaningful problem solving that had drawn me to computer science in the first place. The transition to the coffee shop provided a change of scenery that helped the interview feel more conversational. Radio Coffee was busy with its usual mixture of students and professionals, but the KXAM crew had arrived early enough to secure a quiet corner where we could film without too much background noise. Sarah's questions were thoughtful and well-researched, clearly designed to draw out not just the technical aspects of my work, but the motivation and vision behind it. "Tell me about the decision to start your own company rather than joining an established tech firm," she asked, and I could hear in her that this was one of the questions she was most interested in exploring. I think there's a fundamental difference between building something that serves people and building something that just generates profit, I replied, surprised by how naturally the words came. My app exists because I wanted to solve a real problem that affects millions of people. The financial success will hopefully follow, but it's not the primary motivation. I've seen what happens when profit becomes the only metric that matters, and it usually involves cutting corners or compromising values in ways that I'm not comfortable with. Sarah's follow-up questions were gentle but probing, clearly designed to explore the contrast I'd hinted at between my approach and more traditional business models. When you say you've seen what happens when profit becomes the primary focus, can you elaborate on that? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, the opportunity to articulate my values in contrast to business approaches I disagreed with. I grew up around a family business that prioritized short-term financial gains over long-term sustainability or ethical considerations. I watched regulatory shortcuts being justified as efficiency and compliance issues being treated as acceptable costs of doing business. That taught me that how you build success matters just as much as whether you achieve it. The words felt honest and necessary, even as I realized they represented a point of no return in terms of my relationship with my family's business expectations. Sarah's expression suggested she understood the significance of what I was saying, and her next questions helped me articulate the specific ways my app represented a different approach to technology development. We were deep into a discussion about ethical algorithm design when I noticed a familiar figure through the coffee shop's large front windows. David was standing on the sidewalk outside, talking animatedly on his phone while scanning the interior of the cafe. Even through the glass, I could see the tension in his posture and the aggressive gestures that suggested whoever he was talking to was not happy with whatever information he was providing. Sarah noticed my distraction and followed my gaze to the window. "Someone you know?" she asked, and I realized that David's presence might actually enhance rather than complicate the story she was trying to tell. "That's my older brother," I said carefully. "He works for our family's real estate company, and they've been concerned about some of the things I might say in this interview." The admission hung in the air between us, and I could see Sarah processing the implications. This wasn't just a story about a young entrepreneur starting a tech company. It was a story about someone choosing a fundamentally different path despite significant family pressure to conform to existing business models. "Would you be comfortable talking about that pressure?" Sarah asked, and I could hear in her voice that this was exactly the kind of narrative complexity that made for compelling television. Before I could answer, David appeared at our table, having apparently decided that observing from the sidewalk wasn't providing enough information about what was happening inside. He approached with the kind of forced smile that was meant to appear casual, but couldn't quite hide the underlying tension. "Maya, I didn't realize you were filming here today." His voice carried the artificial brightness of someone performing for cameras while trying to control a situation that was rapidly moving beyond his influence. "David, this is Sarah Martinez from KXAN. We're discussing my cybersecurity app and my plans for starting my own company." Sarah extended her hand professionally, but I could see the journalist's instincts firing as she recognized the story unfolding in front of her. "David, would you be willing to share your perspective on Maya's entrepreneurial ventures? As a family member who works in business, you might have interesting insights about her decision to start her own company." The invitation was politely phrased, but David clearly recognized it as potentially dangerous territory. His smile became even more forced as he declined the on-camera opportunity while simultaneously trying to steer the conversation away from topics that might reflect poorly on the family business. Oh, I wouldn't want to intrude on Maya's moment, but his tone suggested the opposite. I just wanted to make sure she wasn't saying anything that might be misunderstood or taken out of context. Family businesses have to be careful about public relations, you know. The irony of his statement was lost on him, but was clearly not lost on Sarah, who had spent years covering stories about exactly this kind of corporate damage control. The fact that he was more concerned about potential misunderstandings than proud of his sister's achievements told its own story about family priorities. "Actually," I said, feeling a surge of clarity about what needed to happen next, "I think David's concerns about public relations perfectly illustrate the difference between our approaches to business. His focus is on controlling narratives and managing perceptions, while my focus is on building something that genuinely serves people and solves real problems." The contrast was stark when articulated so directly, and David's expression shifted from forced friendliness to barely concealed irritation. He excused himself with obvious reluctance, but not before delivering a parting warning disguised as sibling concern. "Just remember, Maya, that what you say today will affect more people than just yourself.
Actions have consequences, especially when they're broadcast on television. After he left, Sarah and I continued the interview with a new depth that hadn't existed before his interruption. The family pressure was no longer theoretical, it had been demonstrated in real time, providing concrete evidence of the competing values and expectations I'd been describing. That interaction was quite revealing, Sarah observed once the cameras had stopped rolling. It's clear that your family views your independent success as potentially threatening to their business interests. That dynamic adds a powerful layer to your story about choosing ethical innovation over traditional profit maximization. The film
Wrapped up with additional footage of me working on my laptop and discussing the technical aspects of cybersecurity development. By the time the KXEN crew packed up their equipment, I felt both exhausted and exhilarated. The interview had gone beyond my expectations, not just in terms of showcasing my work, but in terms of articulating values and vision that I'd never expressed so clearly before. Jordan had documented the entire process, capturing both the formal interview segments and the impromptu family drama that had unfolded in the middle of filming. Their footage would provide a complete record of how the day had developed, which would prove more valuable than either of us realized. We returned to my apartment in the early afternoon, both of us buzzing with the energy that comes from participating in something that feels significant. The interview wouldn't air until the evening news, but Sarah had indicated that clips would be posted online throughout the afternoon to build anticipation for the full segment. That's when my phone started ringing with a frequency that suggested my parents had received David's report about the morning's events. The calls were coming every few minutes, accompanied by text messages that grew increasingly urgent and threatening as the afternoon progressed. Maya, you need to call us immediately. David says you've said things that could damage our reputation and hurt our business relationships. This is not acceptable. We raised you better than this. Family loyalty means something, and we expect you to honor that commitment regardless of your personal ambitions. If you don't respond within the hour, we're driving down there tonight, and this conversation will happen in person, whether you want it or not. The escalation was rapid and predictable, following patterns I recognized from previous conflicts where my choices had diverged from family expectations. But this time felt different, both because the stakes were higher and because I'd spent the morning articulating values that made compromise feel like betrayal of everything I'd worked to build. Jordan and I were reviewing the interview footage when the first online clips appeared on KXAN's social media channels. The segments they'd chosen to preview were perfectly selected to generate interest. My explanation of the app's innovative approach to identity theft prevention, my comments about ethical algorithm design, and most tellingly, the brief exchange with David that illustrated the family pressure I was facing. The response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Comments poured in from viewers who appreciated both the technical innovation and the honesty about family conflict. Tech industry professionals shared the clips with commentary about the importance of ethical development practices. Local entrepreneurs posted supportive messages about the courage required to choose independent paths despite family pressure. But the social media attention also meant that my parents were now aware of exactly what had been said and how it was being received by the public. The phone call stopped abruptly around 4 p.m., replaced by a single text message that carried more weight than all of the previous threats combined. We're on our way to Austin. Be home by 6 p.m. The drive from their Westlake Hills house to my apartment near campus was only about 20 minutes, which meant they'd probably left immediately after seeing the online previews of the interview. The prospect of a face-to-face confrontation in my own apartment felt both inevitable and terrifying. But it also felt necessary. This conflict had been building for months, maybe years, and it was better to resolve it definitively than to continue navigating the constant tension of competing expectations. Jordan offered to stay for moral support, but I declined. This conversation needed to happen between family members, without outside witnesses who might complicate the dynamics or become targets for my parents' frustration. Whatever was about to unfold, I wanted to face it directly and honestly, just as I'd approached the morning's interview.
I spent the time before their arrival organizing my apartment and gathering the documentation that proved my financial independence. Bank statements showing scholarship deposits, grant award letters, receipts for equipment purchases, and employment records from my part-time work throughout college. If this conversation was going to involve accusations about family support or suggestions that my success belonged to them, I wanted concrete evidence to refute those claims. The knock on my door came at exactly 6 p.m., sharp and insistent in a way that suggested barely contained anger. I opened it to find both my parents standing in the hallway, my father's expression cold and controlled, while my mother's face showed the kind of fury I'd learned to recognize as dangerous throughout my childhood. "We need to talk," my father said without preamble, pushing past me into the apartment as if he owned it. My mother followed, her gaze immediately scanning the space with a kind of critical assessment that found fault with everything from my furniture choices to my housekeeping standards. "This is what our money bought you," she said, gesturing dismissively at my modest living space. "A cramped apartment near campus so you can play computer games and embarrass our family on television?" The characterization of my work as computer games was calculated to diminish and dismiss everything I'd accomplished throughout college. Their visit wasn't about having a conversation, it was about reasserting control and demanding compliance with expectations I never agreed to meet. "Actually," I said, maintaining my composure, despite the deliberately provocative nature of my mother's comments, "this apartment was paid for entirely with money I earned through scholarships, grants, and part-time work throughout college. Your financial contribution to my education was minimal and well documented." I handed my father the folder of financial records I'd prepared, watching his expression shift as he realized I had concrete evidence to support my claims. The scholarship letters alone totaled more than twice what they'd contributed to my education, while the grant documentation proved that my research work had been funded entirely through academic merit rather than family connections. "That's not the point," my mother snapped, clearly frustrated that her attempt to minimize my achievements through financial guilt wasn't working as intended. "The point is that you went on television and said things that make our family business look bad. You made it sound like we're unethical or corrupt." The accusation hung in the air between us, and I realized this was the moment where I needed to decide whether to continue protecting them,
Reputation, or to stand by the values I'd articulated in the interview. The choice felt significant, not just for our immediate relationship, but for the kind of person I wanted to become. "I didn't say anything that wasn't true," I replied carefully. "I talked about my own values and my own approach to business. If that makes your company look bad by comparison, maybe the problem isn't with what I said." The words were quietly spoken, but they landed like a bomb in the small space of my apartment. My father's controlled expression cracked slightly, revealing the anger he'd been working to contain, while my mother's face flushed with the fury that made her next words feel inevitable. "You ungrateful little brat," she said, her voice rising to a volume that probably carried through the thin walls to my neighbors' apartments. "After everything we've done for you, after all the opportunities we provided, this is how you repay us? By going on television and trashing the business that put food on your table and clothes on your back?" The verbal assault was familiar in its pattern, but more intense than usual in its delivery. Throughout my childhood, any challenge to family authority or deviation from expected behavior had been met with accusations of ingratitude and reminders of my dependence on their generosity. But this time, surrounded by evidence of my own achievements and financial independence, the accusations felt hollow rather than devastating. "I'm not ungrateful," I said, standing up from the couch where I'd been sitting and moving to face them directly. "I'm grateful for the education you helped provide, even though my records show that I covered most of the costs myself. I'm grateful for the roof over my head during childhood, even though that's a basic parental responsibility rather than extraordinary generosity. But I'm not grateful for the constant pressure to abandon my own dreams in favor of a business that operates in ways I find ethically questionable." The honesty felt both liberating and terrifying, but it also felt necessary. I had spent 22 years moderating my words and compromising my values to maintain family peace, and the cost of that compromise had become too high to continue paying. My father stepped forward, his voice dropping to the low, controlled tone he used when he was truly angry. Those ethically questionable practices built the life you've enjoyed your entire existence. The house you grew up in, the vacations we took, the private schools you attended before college, all of that was paid for by the business you're now criticizing on public television. And I never asked for any of it, I replied, surprised by how calm my voice sounded despite the emotional intensity of the confrontation. I would have been perfectly happy growing up in a smaller house if it meant having parents who were proud of my achievements rather than constantly trying to redirect them toward goals I never shared. The admission revealed something I'd never quite articulated before. The material benefits of my childhood had never compensated for the emotional cost of feeling like my own dreams and values were consistently undervalued. The private schools and family vacations had been nice, but they hadn't made up for years of feeling like I was a disappointment for pursuing academic excellence instead of business networking. "This is ridiculous," my mother said, clearly frustrated that her usual tactics weren't producing the desired results. "You're 22 years old with no business experience and no understanding of how the real world works. The fact that you can write some computer programs doesn't make you qualified to start a company or criticize people who've been successful for decades." The dismissive characterization of my work as some computer programs revealed everything I needed to know about how my family viewed my accomplishments. Despite 4 years of academic excellence, despite recognition from professors and industry professionals, despite concrete evidence of innovation and technical skill, they still saw my work as a hobby rather than a legitimate foundation for professional success. "You're right that I'm 22 and just starting out," I said, moving toward my laptop and opening the folder where I kept documentation of my app's development process. "But I'm also summa cum laude in computer science from a respected university. I've built a cybersecurity application that's already generated interest from major tech companies, and I've done all of this while maintaining complete financial independence from any source that might compromise my ability to make ethical decisions." I turned the laptop screen toward them, showing the interface of my app alongside testimonials from beta testers and preliminary interest letters from potential investors. The evidence of my competence and the market viability of my work was overwhelming, but I could see in their expressions that they were more interested in maintaining control rather than acknowledging my capabilities. "None of that matters if you can't learn to work within existing systems," my father said, his tone suggesting that this was the core issue from his perspective. "Business success requires compromise and pragmatism. The fact that you're willing to criticize your own family on television shows that you lack the discretion and loyalty that clients expect from professional partners." The accusation crystallized something I'd been thinking about throughout this entire confrontation. From their perspective, my honesty about values and ethical concerns represented a character flaw rather than a strength. They genuinely believed that success requires compromising principles and that my unwillingness to do so indicated immaturity rather than integrity. If business success requires compromising the values that make me feel good about my work, then I don't want that kind of success. I'd rather build something smaller that I can be proud of than build something larger that requires me to ignore how it affects other people. The silence that followed was heavy with implications. We'd moved beyond a simple disagreement about career choices to a fundamental conflict about values and priorities that couldn't be resolved through compromise or family pressure. Either I was going to continue pursuing my own path, or I was going to subordinate my goals to their expectations. But we couldn't continue pretending that both options were compatible. My mother broke the silence with a statement that felt like a final ultimatum. "If you continue down this path, if you keep saying things that damage our reputation and hurt our business, then you'll be doing it without any support from this family. No financial help, no networking connections, no family events. You'll be on your own completely." The threat was meant to be devastating, designed to force me to choose between my principles and my family relationships. But as I looked around my small apartment filled with evidence of my own achievements and independence, I realized that being on my own completely didn't sound like a punishment. It sounded like freedom. "That's fine," I said, and I meant it. I've been functionally on my own throughout college anyway. The only difference will be that now we're all being honest about it, instead of pretending that family support was something I could count on. The words hung in the air as my parents processed the fact that their ultimate threat had been met with acceptance rather than capitulation. They'd expected me to back down, to choose family relationships over personal integrity, but instead I'd called their bluff and chosen independence over compromise. My father gathered up the financial documents I'd shown him, his movements sharp with barely controlled anger. "You'll regret this decision," he said as they moved toward the door. "When your little computer company fails and you realize how difficult it is to succeed without family connections, don't expect us to welcome you back with open arms." "I won't," I replied simply, and watched them leave my apartment for what I suspected might be the last time. After they left, I sat in the silence of my apartment and waited to feel devastated or regretful about the bridges I'd just burned. Instead, I felt lighter than I had in years. The weight of family expectations and the constant pressure to compromise my values had lifted, replaced by the exhilarating possibility of building something entirely my own. Jordan texted around 8 p.m. to ask how the interview had been received, and I filled them in on the evening's dramatic confrontation. Their response was characteristically supportive. "Sometimes the trash takes itself out. How are you feeling about everything?" I considered the question seriously before answering. How was I feeling about choosing my principles over my family relationships, about accepting complete independence in exchange for maintaining my integrity, about burning bridges that might never be rebuilt? "Free," I texted back, and realized it was the truest thing I'd said all day. The KXAN interview aired during the 10 p.m. news, and I watched it from my couch with a mixture of pride and nervousness. Sarah Martinez had crafted a compelling narrative about young entrepreneurs choosing ethical innovation over traditional profit models, using my story as an example of how generational conflicts often reflect deeper disagreements about business values. The segment featured my technical explanations of the cybersecurity app, my comments about ethical algorithm design, and most powerfully, the brief interaction with David that illustrated the family pressure I'd been facing. The editing was fair and thoughtful, presenting me as someone who had chosen a difficult but principled path, rather than as a rebellious child rejecting family wisdom. The online response was immediate and overwhelmingly positive. Comments poured in from viewers who appreciated both the technical innovation and the honesty about family conflicts. Tech industry professionals shared the segment with commentary about the importance of ethical development practices. Local entrepreneurs posted supportive messages about the courage required to choose independent paths despite family pressure. More importantly, several potential investors and business partners reached out through my website and social media channels, interested in learning more about my app and my plans for developing it into a full-scale business. The interview had accomplished exactly what I'd hoped. It had established my credibility as a serious entrepreneur while clearly articulating the values that would guide my business decisions. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on how dramatically my life had changed in the span of a single day. I'd gone from someone struggling to balance family expectations with personal goals to someone who had chosen independence and integrity over compromise and approval. The choice had been difficult, but it had also been necessary. The week that followed brought a cascade of opportunities that confirmed I'd made the right decision. 3 separate investment groups requested meetings to discuss funding for my cybersecurity app. 2 major tech companies reached out about potential partnerships or acquisition discussions. A startup incubator in Austin invited me to apply for their next cohort, offering mentorship and resources specifically designed for early-stage technology companies. Most surprisingly, several other young entrepreneurs contacted me to share their own stories about choosing independent paths despite family pressure. The interview had apparently resonated with people facing similar conflicts between traditional expectations and innovative ambitions, creating connections I never could have anticipated. My family's silence was complete and absolute. No calls, no texts, no emails acknowledging the opportunities that were emerging from the interview they'd tried to prevent. Their absence from my life became a confirmation rather than a loss, proof that their support had always been conditional on my compliance with their expectations. 6 months later,
My cybersecurity app launched officially with funding from an investor group that specialized in ethical technology development. The company grew rapidly, driven by a market demand for identity protection solutions that prioritized user privacy over data monetization. Within a year, we had expanded to a team of 12 employees and were processing partnerships with major corporations seeking to enhance their cybersecurity protocols. The success felt different from what I had imagined when I was younger and still hoped for family approval. It was entirely my own, built on principles I believed in and accomplished through work I was proud of. There was no need to compromise or justify or explain why I'd chosen innovation over tradition, because the results spoke for themselves. Jordan documented the entire journey, from that first graduation day through the interview and the family confrontation to the eventual business success. Their footage became part of a documentary about young entrepreneurs that premiered at South by Southwest, bringing additional attention to the importance of supporting innovation even when it challenges established business models. I never saw my parents or David again, though I occasionally heard updates through Aunt Sarah, who had chosen to maintain relationships with both sides of the family divide. According to her, Chen Properties had continued its pattern of regulatory shortcuts and compliance issues, eventually facing a major investigation that resulted in significant fines and damaged business relationships. The reputation they'd been so concerned about protecting had been undermined by their own practices rather than by mine.
Anything I'd said in my interview. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it also wasn't satisfying in the way I might have expected. I'd moved beyond needing validation through their failures. My success was complete and meaningful entirely on its own terms. 2 years after graduation, I was featured on the cover of Austin Business Journal as one of the city's most promising young entrepreneurs. The article focused on how my cybersecurity company was revolutionizing identity protection while maintaining the highest ethical standards in an industry often criticized for prioritizing profits over user privacy. Reading that article in my new office space downtown, surrounded by a team of brilliant developers working on problems that mattered, I finally understood what my college professors had been trying to teach me. Sometimes the most important choice you can make is to define success for yourself, rather than accepting definitions imposed by others, even when those others are family members who claim to have your best interests at heart. The notification sound from my phone interrupted my reflection, bringing me back to the present moment. It was a text from Jordan, characteristically brief but meaningful. Saw the cover story. Still proud of that 22-year-old who chose principles over pressure. You did good, Maya. I smiled, saving the message and returning to the technical documentation I'd been reviewing. There was still work to do, problems to solve, and innovations to develop. The difference was that now I was doing it all on my own terms, guided by values I'd chosen rather than expectations I'd inherited. The late afternoon sun streamed through the windows of my office, illuminating the computers and whiteboards that represented the foundation of everything I'd built. It was a good life, an honest life, and most importantly, it was entirely my own. 5 years had passed since that transformative Monday morning when everything changed, and I was standing in the green room of the Austin Convention Center, adjusting my blazer one final time before taking the stage at South by Southwest Interactive. The conference badge hanging around my neck read, Maya Chen, CEO and founder, CyberShield Technologies, and beneath it, in smaller print, Keynote, Ethical Innovation in the Digital Age. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on me. 5 years ago, my family had dismissed my graduation as unimportant enough to skip for business meetings and book clubs. Today, I was about to address an audience of 3,000 technology professionals, venture capitalists, and entrepreneurs from around the world, sharing insights about building companies that prioritized user protection over profit maximization. CyberShield had grown beyond anything I had imagined that nervous morning when Sarah Martinez first interviewed me for KXAN. What had started as a college capstone project had evolved into a comprehensive cybersecurity platform protecting over 2 million users across 43 countries.
Our algorithm had prevented an estimated $847 million in identity theft losses, while our commitment to user privacy had set new industry standards that competitors were scrambling to match. The company's success had brought recognition I'd never expected. Time magazine had included me in their 30 Under 30 Tech Innovators. Forbes had featured CyberShield in their annual Companies to Watch issue. Harvard Business School had written a case study about our ethical development model that was now required reading in their entrepreneurship program. But none of those accolades felt as significant as the emails I received weekly from users whose lives had been protected by software I'd built in my cramped apartment near campus. Jordan appeared in the green room doorway, now sporting the credentials of a senior technology reporter for the Wall Street Journal. Their coverage of emerging tech companies had earned them a Pulitzer nomination, and they'd leveraged that success into becoming one of the most respected voices in technology journalism. But they still made time to document the major moments in my journey, and today was no exception. "Ready to tell the story one more time?" they asked, adjusting their professional camera equipment with the same careful attention they'd shown that first day filming in my apartment. Though I suppose this audience will be a bit different from the local Austin news crowd. The understatement made me smile. Today's keynote would be broadcast live to technology conferences in 12 cities, with streaming coverage reaching an estimated global audience of over 100,000 people. The presentation I'd spent weeks perfecting would outline the business case for ethical technology development, using CyberShield's growth trajectory as proof that companies could prioritize user protection without sacrificing profitability. The technical aspects of the presentation weren't what made me nervous. What made my hands shake slightly as I reviewed my notes was the personal story I'd decided to include, the narrative about choosing principles over family approval that had started this entire journey. Today would be the first time I'd told that story to a professional audience, and I wasn't entirely sure how it would be received. The decision to include personal elements in a business presentation had been controversial even within my own company. My chief operating officer, Marcus Rivera, had suggested focusing purely on technical innovations and market performance. My head of marketing, Dr. Lisa Park, had worried that family conflict might distract from our professional accomplishments. But my board of directors, led by venture capitalist Ellen Wu, had strongly supported the inclusion of personal narrative as essential context for understanding our company's values-driven approach. "The tech industry is full of brilliant people who can build innovative products," Ellen had argued during our final preparation meeting. "What makes CyberShield different isn't just your technical capabilities, it's your willingness to make difficult choices in service of principles that many companies only pay lip service to. That story matters, especially for young entrepreneurs who are facing similar pressures to compromise their values for faster growth or easier funding." Her perspective had convinced me, but it had also added emotional weight to what was already a high-stakes presentation. Speaking about algorithms and market penetration felt comfortable. Speaking about family estrangement and the cost of independence felt vulnerable in ways that professional success hadn't quite prepared me for. A knock on the green room door interrupted my reflection. Dr. Patricia Williams entered, wearing the kind of proud smile I'd grown to associate with significant moments throughout my academic and professional journey. She'd taken early retirement from UT the previous year,
Had maintained her involvement with the computer science program as a professor emeritus, focusing specifically on mentoring students who showed potential for entrepreneurial ventures. "Maya, I wanted to catch you before you went on stage," she said, crossing the room to give me the kind of warm hug that reminded me why her support had meant so much during those difficult early years. "I've been thinking about that conversation we had during your senior year, when you were worried about whether your family would ever understand what you were building. I don't think either of us imagined it would lead to this." The memory was vivid and bittersweet. I'd gone to her office after a particularly frustrating phone call with my parents, seeking guidance about whether I was making a mistake by prioritizing my own vision over family expectations. She'd listened patiently to my concerns, then offered advice that had shaped my approach to every major decision since. "Sometimes the most important thing you can do is trust yourself enough to disappoint people who don't understand your dreams." I still remember that advice, I told her, feeling the familiar gratitude that came with reflecting on how much her mentorship had influenced my path. It's probably the reason I had the courage to choose independence over approval, though I have to admit I never expected independence to lead to anything quite this visible. Dr. Williams laughed, the sound carrying the warmth that had made her such an effective teacher and mentor throughout her academic career. Visibility was never the goal, was it? The goal was building something meaningful that aligned with your values. Everything else has been a natural consequence of staying true to that original vision. Her observation was accurate and reassuring. CyberShield's growth hadn't been driven by a desire for recognition or media attention. It had been driven by a commitment to solving real problems through ethical innovation. The attention had followed naturally as our work gained recognition within the industry, but it had never been the primary motivation for the choices I'd made. The stage manager appeared in the doorway, wearing the kind of focused expression that indicated it was time for final preparations. "Miss Chen, we're ready for you in 5 minutes. The audience is seated and all technical systems are functioning normally. Do you need anything before we begin?" I declined her offer of water or additional microphone checks, feeling as ready as I was likely to get for what would probably be the most significant professional presentation of my career. The butterflies in my stomach weren't entirely unpleasant. They felt more like anticipation than anxiety, the kind of energy that came with approaching something important rather than something threatening. Jordan gathered their equipment and headed toward the photography area reserved for credentialed media, while Dr. Williams wished me luck and made her way to the reserved seating section where several of my former professors and current company executives would be watching. The green room emptied except for me and the stage manager, leaving me with a few final moments to center myself before stepping into the spotlight. The presentation I was about to give represented more than just a business case study or a technical overview of cybersecurity innovations. It was a validation of every difficult choice I'd made since that graduation day when my family had chosen business meetings over celebrating my achievements. More importantly, it was an opportunity to encourage other young entrepreneurs to trust their own judgment, even when that judgment conflicted with expectations from family, investors, or industry conventional wisdom. The stage manager's voice came through my earpiece. "Ms. Chen, you're on in 30 seconds. The audience is excited to hear from you, and the live stream numbers are looking fantastic. Break a leg out there." I took a deep breath, adjusted my jacket one final time, and walked toward the stage entrance. The auditorium beyond was a sea of faces representing every aspect of the technology industry I dreamed of joining since my freshman year computer science courses. Venture capitalists who had funded companies that changed the world, entrepreneurs who had built innovations that improved millions of lives, engineers and developers and designers who were working on problems I could only imagine. But as I stepped into the lights and approached the podium, I wasn't thinking about their accomplishments or their expectations. I was thinking about the 22-year-old version of myself who had sat in a cramped apartment, reading text messages that dismissed her dreams as computer games and threatened consequences for choosing independence over compliance. "Good morning," I began, my voice carrying clearly through the convention center's sophisticated audio system. "My name is Maya Chen, and 5 years ago, my parents told me I was wasting my time playing with computers instead of joining the family real estate business. Today, I'm here to talk about why they were wrong, and more importantly, why it's crucial that young entrepreneurs learn to trust their own judgment even when the people closest to them don't understand their vision." The opening was more personal than most keynote presentations at technology conferences, but the audience's attention was immediate and complete. I could see in their faces the recognition that this wouldn't be a typical corporate success story, rather an honest exploration of the personal costs and professional benefits of choosing principles over convenience. I spent the next 45 minutes walking them through CyberShield's development journey, from the initial college project, through the family conflicts that had nearly derailed my confidence, to the ethical framework that had guided our business decisions and ultimately enabled our market success. The technical details were important, but the emotional narrative seemed to resonate even more powerfully with an audience that included many entrepreneurs who had faced similar pressures to compromise their values for faster growth or easier funding. The question and answer session that followed was more engaged than I had expected, with inquiries ranging from specific algorithm implementations to broader questions about maintaining company culture during rapid scaling. But the question that stayed with me came from a young woman in the audience who identified herself as a recent computer science graduate, facing family pressure to join a traditional consulting firm instead of pursuing her own startup idea. "How do you know when you're being principled versus when you're just being stubborn?" How do you tell the difference between having integrity and just being afraid of taking practical advice from people who love you? The question was thoughtful and complex, touching on the fundamental challenge of distinguishing between principled independence and stubborn rebellion. I considered my response carefully, drawing on 5 years of experience navigating the consequences of the choices I'd made. I think the difference is in what drives the decision, I finally answered. If you're avoiding practical advice because it's difficult or challenging, that's probably stubbornness. But if you're rejecting advice because it requires you to compromise values that are fundamental to who you are and what you want to build, that's probably integrity. The key is being honest with yourself about which category your situation falls into. I paused, thinking about my own journey and the moments when that distinction had been most crucial. In my case, joining my family's business would have required me to accept practices I found ethically questionable and to abandon work I found meaningful and important. The choice wasn't between easy and difficult. It was between comfortable and authentic. Once I understood that distinction, the decision became much clearer. The young woman nodded, and I could see in her expression the same mixture of uncertainty and determination I'd felt at her age. After the session ended, she approached the stage to continue the conversation, and I found myself offering the same kind of encouragement I'd received from Dr. Williams during my own moments of doubt. The hardest part isn't making the decision, I told her as we talked near the edge of the stage. The hardest part is living with the consequences when people you care about don't understand or support your choices. But if you build something meaningful and successful, eventually the results speak for themselves in ways that make the initial conflict feel worthwhile. As the convention center began emptying and the technical crews started dismantling equipment, I reflected on how different this day felt from that nervous Monday morning 5 years ago when I'd first articulated my values in front of a television camera. The principles were the same, but the platform was vastly larger, and the validation complete in ways I'd never quite dared to hope for. Jordan found me near the stage, having finished their interviews with audience members and industry experts who had attended the presentation. Their expression carried the satisfaction that came with documenting moments they recognized as historically significant, even if that significance might not be apparent until years later. So, they said, packing away their camera equipment with the efficient movements of someone who had covered hundreds of similar events, how does it feel to officially become the poster child for choosing principles over family approval? The characterization was accurate, if slightly overwhelming. The presentation had been recorded and would be shared across multiple platforms, potentially reaching audiences far beyond the technology industry. My story about family conflict and ethical business development would become part of the permanent record of entrepreneurial advice available to future generations of young people facing similar choices. Surreal, I admitted, looking out at the now empty auditorium where thousands of people had just heard the most personal aspects of my professional journey. 5 years ago, I was worried about disappointing my parents by starting my own company. Today, I'm encouraging other people to make similar choices, even when their families don't understand. The irony is pretty intense. Jordan nodded, understanding the complexity of emotions that came with such dramatic role reversals. They'd been documenting my journey long enough to remember the uncertainty and family pressure that had made every early decision feel monumental. The transformation from anxious college graduate to confident industry leader had been gradual but undeniable. As we left the convention center and walked through downtown Austin, I found myself thinking about the parallel universe where I'd made different choices. In that alternative timeline, I was probably working for Chen Properties, helping develop real estate projects that prioritize profit margins over environmental impact, attending industry events where success was measured purely through financial metrics rather than social contribution. The contrast was stark and clarifying. That version of my life might have been more comfortable in some ways, free from the uncertainty and family conflict that had marked my actual journey, but it also would have been fundamentally hollow, built on compromises that would have made professional success feel like personal failure. My phone buzzed with a text message from Ellen Wu, my lead investor and board chair.
Watched the live stream from San Francisco. Incredible presentation that perfectly captured why we invested in CyberShield in the first place. The response on social media has been overwhelmingly positive, and I've already had 3 inquiries from other VCs asking about companies with similar ethical frameworks. The message was gratifying, both for its immediate praise and for its implications about broader industry interest and values-driven business models. CyberShield's success had proven that ethical technology development could be profitable, but our approach still represented a minority position within an industry that often prioritized growth over governance. Today's presentation might help tip that balance toward more responsible innovation practices. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the Austin streets as Jordan and I made our way to a celebration dinner at one of the city's better restaurants. The guest list included Dr. Williams, several former professors, my core team from CyberShield, and Aunt Sarah, who had driven down from Dallas specifically for the keynote presentation. The absence of my immediate family was notable, but no longer painful in the way that it had been during those early years of independence. Aunt Sarah had maintained relationships with both sides of the family divide, providing occasional updates about my parents and David without pressuring me to reconcile or expressing judgment about the estrangement. According to her latest report, Chen Properties had continued its pattern of regulatory shortcuts and eventually faced a federal investigation that resulted in significant fines and the forced sale of several development projects. The reputation they'd been so concerned about protecting had been damaged by their own practices rather than anything I'd said in that long-ago television interview. The irony provided a certain satisfaction, but it also served as validation of the instincts that had guided my decision to pursue independent success rather than joining their business model.
Choices I'd made based on ethical concerns had proven prescient in ways I couldn't have predicted at the time. Dinner conversation ranged from technical discussions about cybersecurity innovations to broader reflections on the role of values in business development. Dr. Williams shared updates about current students who are pursuing entrepreneurial projects, several of whom had specifically mentioned my story as inspiration for choosing challenging but principled paths over more conventional career options. You've become a case study, she told me as we shared dessert and reflected on the day's events, not just in business schools, but in computer science programs and even philosophy courses that explore the relationship between personal ethics and professional success. Students who've never met you are making career decisions based on the example you've set. The observation was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. I'd never intended to become a role model or a symbol of anything beyond my own determination to build something meaningful, but the visibility that came with business success had apparently transformed my personal choices into public examples that influenced how other people thought about similar decisions. As the evening wound down and our group began dispersing to hotels and homes around Austin, I found myself walking alone through the downtown streets I'd known since college. The city had grown dramatically during the 5 years of CyberShield's development, with new tech companies and startup incubators transforming neighborhoods that had been primarily residential when I was a student. The changes felt symbolic of the broader transformation in my own life, from uncertain college graduate to confident industry leader. But unlike the urban development that had displaced longtime residents and altered community character, my personal growth had been built on foundations that remained constant. The values that had guided my initial decision to choose independence over family approval were the same values that shaped CyberShield's business practices and my approach to industry leadership. My apartment building came into view as I rounded the corner from South Lamar, the same modest complex where I'd lived during college and where I'd chosen to remain despite the financial success that would have allowed for much more luxurious accommodations. The decision to stay had been partly practical, since the location remained convenient for both downtown meetings and campus visits, but it had also been partly sentimental, a way of staying connected to the person I'd been when these choices were first taking shape. The notification sound from my phone interrupted my reflection, bringing me back to the present moment. It was an email from a literary agent in New York expressing interest in representing a book about my journey from family conflict to business success. Your story represents exactly the kind of authentic entrepreneurial narrative that publishers are looking for, the message read. The combination of technical innovation and personal courage creates a compelling template for other young people facing similar choices. The suggestion was intriguing, but also slightly surreal. I'd never considered myself a writer, and the idea of expanding my story into book length felt like yet another unexpected consequence of choices I'd made for entirely different reasons. But there was something appealing about the possibility of reaching even broader audiences with encouragement about trusting their own judgment despite family pressure or conventional wisdom. I saved the email to review more carefully later when I wasn't still processing the emotions of the day's keynote presentation. The decision about whether to write a book could wait. For now, it was enough to reflect on how far the journey had progressed from that nervous Monday morning when everything had changed. As I climbed the stairs to my apartment, I thought about the 22-year-old version of myself who had made the initial choice to prioritize principles over approval. She couldn't have imagined the keynote presentations or the industry recognition or the requests for book deals. But she would have recognized the satisfaction that came with building something meaningful on her own terms, guided by values she'd chosen rather than expectations she'd inherited. The apartment felt different that evening, charged with the energy of completed cycles and new possibilities. 5 years of independent success had validated every difficult choice, but more importantly, it had created a foundation for whatever challenges and opportunities lay ahead. The story that had begun with family disappointment and graduation day conflict had evolved into something much larger and more significant than I'd ever dared to hope. Tomorrow would bring new projects and ongoing responsibilities, the daily work of leading a growing company and maintaining the ethical standards that had made our success possible. But tonight, I allowed myself to feel proud of the journey that had brought me from confused college graduate to confident industry leader, from family disappointment to keynote speaker at one of the world's most prestigious technology conferences. The path had been difficult and sometimes lonely, marked by sacrifices that felt enormous at the time and family relationships that might never be repaired. But it had also been authentic and meaningful in ways that compromise and accommodation never could have achieved. Most importantly, it had been entirely my own, built on choices I could defend and accomplishments I could celebrate without reservation or regret. As I prepared for bed that night, I reflected on the questions from young entrepreneurs who had approached me after the presentation, seeking guidance about their own choices between family expectations and personal vision. The advice I'd offered was simple, but hard-earned. Trust yourself enough to disappoint people who don't understand your dreams, and build something so meaningful that eventual success speaks louder than initial criticism. It was the same advice Dr. Williams had given me during my senior year, and the same lesson I'd learned through 5 years of independent achievement. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is choose authenticity over approval, even when that choice comes with costs that feel unbearable at the time. The notification sound from my phone brought one final message of the day, a text from Jordan, characteristically brief but meaningful. Proud of that 22-year-old who chose principles over pressure, and even prouder of the 27-year-old who's using her platform to encourage others to make similar choices. You've become exactly who you were meant to be. I smiled, saving the message and turning off the lights in my apartment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and opportunities, but tonight I felt complete satisfaction with the choices that had brought me to this moment. The story that had begun with family disappointment and graduation day conflict had evolved into something much larger and more significant than I'd ever imagined possible. The journey from confused college graduate to confident industry leader had been marked by difficult decisions and costly sacrifices, but it had also been authentic and meaningful in ways that compromise and accommodation never could have achieved. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.